Hey everyone, Box Gods here, and welcome to our Monsoon Modular Reservoir Systems how-to video series. This is video number 2 in the series, and today we're going to be covering basic assembly. If you haven't watched the first video in this series, which covered, it was an overview and covered all the various different end caps, tension rods, tubes, lights, mounts, etc., I strongly suggest you watch that so that you have a better understanding of the different parts that are available to you to use in your reservoir assembly. As I said, today we're going to be covering basic assembly. For the example, we're going to build a very standard ports on the ends, basic mounts, some lights. This is probably the same type of tube reservoir you'd see in 80% of the builds out there right now. For our example today, we're going to be using a 200mm blue tube. You can see the part number there. The 200, or the 3-digit number designates the length. The last 2 digits will designate the color. For our example, we're going to be using a 200mm long blue reservoir tube. We're going to be using 200mm blue tension rods. Part number again, TR for tension rods, 200 for the millimeters in length, and blue for the color. Anytime you see the last 2 digits that are a letter color code like that, BL for blue, RD for red, MB for matte black, etc. These are the screws that come with it. The tension rods. Go ahead and set those up there for now. Our tube, so you can keep everything from rolling off the desk here. I'm going to be using a very standard end cap. This is a single port, molded from nylon. It has mounting holes so that you can mount the mount perpendicular, 60 degrees left or 60 degrees right. Comes with an O-ring. I'm going to go ahead and put that in right now so I don't lose it. I could use a side-facing end cap for the other end. It would end up being about like this. Basically, you've got 3 ports on this end because this is the 3-port cap, and 2 side-facing ports. But since we're covering basic assembly today, I'm going to go ahead and just use a 0 port on the other end. The part number for that is EC for end cap, and the ZP stands for 0 port. All the parts come packaged basically like this. O-ring. When it comes out of the bag, you might see a little bit of what looks like oil on there. It's actually plastic conditioner that we use to stop the etching process. It's not a big deal, just wipe it off. You shouldn't see it. These are early production parts, but if you do, don't panic. It just wipes right off. And one perfectly ready to go part. We're going to be using 25mm mounts, which look like this. Put those right there. Set our screws up over here. The tension rods come with the screws that you need, and there are 2 Allen wrenches in there. Alrighty, what's left? These are the lights we're going to be using. I'm going to just set those aside for right now. Need one more mount. This is the mount, MT for mount, 25mm is the mounting height, and blue for blue, BL for blue. They come wrapped in tissue to protect the finish. We include a hex wrench, which we will need for this example. And a mount. That should be everything we need. going to go ahead and take the O-ring, make sure that you have to inspect the O-rings, make sure they're clean, no lint, inspect the channel where it goes into. Probably 95% of the time when we have a customer that contacts me about a leak, it's almost always about a cat hair or an eyelash or a piece of Cheeto crumb or something that has gotten into that O-ring channel. Whether it's fittings, plugs, whatever. O-rings are wonderful, but they're not magical. If you have debris in there that breaks the seal or creates a bridge, it doesn't matter how much you tighten down the screws, it's still going to leak. If you keep tightening and keep tightening, the chances are you're just going to strip out screws. The best thing to do is, obviously the very best thing to do is to make sure everything's clean before you put it together, but if you do find a situation where you've got a very slow leak, it's almost always going to be some kind of debris in the O-ring or where it mates up against. In very, very odd cases, you may have damaged the O-ring and got a crease in it or something. So make sure you're assembling anything with O-rings on a clean surface and you inspected them. Barring that, if you find that you do have a slow leak, you're just going to have to go ahead and take it apart and clean out those O-rings, clean out the O-ring seal, inspect the O-rings for any kind of damage, and reassemble the unit. Again, much better to just do it right the first time. Alright, first thing we're going to do, start our tension rods. If you're not familiar with how the reservoirs work, there's an O-ring in each end cap. Of course, I should have said that before. I'll just show you this one. There's an O-ring in each end cap. The end caps go on each end. The tension rods are in between. As you tighten the screws, it basically draws the two end caps towards each other, which crushes the O-ring against the end of the tube. Nothing overly complicated, kind of just good old-fashioned mechanical engineering. In the tension rods, these are solid rods. They're not tubes, and they're machined from stainless. I don't know if it'll show on the end. There are wrench flats. You don't need them for this type of assembly, but when you get into using the couplers and some of the more complicated parts, which you'll see in later videos, there's a little wrench that's included that you can put on there to tighten down with. Again, for what we're doing today, we don't need it. Basically, I'm just going to start finger tightening these to get them going. I'm not going to do too much fast forwarding in this video because all of this is stuff you sort of need to know. When I'm putting that together, I hit kind of a tough spot right there. It's something that's not lining up right. Give it a little wiggle. I'm not going to worry about it too much. I'll come back with the wrench. I'm just doing these finger tight for right now. As long as they're started, the screws won't fall out. I'm not too worried about it. Normally you'd use the wrench that comes with these. It's a little hex wrench. It's fine if you're just building one or two, but since I'm doing a lot of these and I want to speed the video up, I'm going to use a universal ball driver. The end of this is actually just like the hex wrench, except it has a ball end. What that allows you to do is drive the screws at an angle. I'm just giving those a little tight. I'm not going too crazy yet. Basically just draw on the tension rod down. The other problem that you'll see a lot of people that aren't familiar with this, even people that are fairly mechanically inclined and have done a lot of automotive work or plumbing work, the second most common thing we see for customer issues is they've stripped out threads. It's because they're used to using much larger screws. If you're using an M6 screw or larger, or a 1/4 inch screw, see, got a big old cat hair in there. No comment. Next thing we're going to do is take the one quick thing to cover on the mounting holes. You want to make sure that you line the mounting holes up correctly, because if you get the other end on and it's twisted around, your mounts won't line up. So I can see that I've got one right there. Alrighty. This is a little harder to do with the camera in front of me, but you'll get the basic idea. Let me just making sure I got the holes lined up. It's kind of a pain in the butt, then they pop into place and you're all set. Just check which one is keeping you out, like it's that one right there. Just push it over, and we're in place. Don't let it pop off, you'll have to do that again. I'm just barely getting the thread started on these so that I don't have it pop apart. As I'm screwing it down, I can feel the cap start to draw down. As soon as I feel it to start to draw down, I move on to the next screw, because you don't want to tighten one screw all the way down and then go to the next one and tighten it down. You want to tighten this one a little bit, just like you were doing the wheel of a car. Tighten this one a little bit, then go to this one, tighten it a little bit, go to that one, tighten it a little bit. Basically going to go to the opposite screw each time so that you don't draw it down unevenly, which is what you're going to see me basically do. I'm just tightening down until I feel it move a little bit. Like right there, I felt it move. You'll also get to a point where you feel the rod start to spin. If you've got one that's not moving right because the rod's spinning, just put the wrench in on the other end. And again, I don't know if it'll show, but right when I see it to start to move, I go to the next one. I'm just being careful not to tighten one down much faster than the rest of them and cause it to have uneven pressure mapping. Again, I got my finger right here on the up against the cap, and then on the rod that I'm tightening, so that I can feel when it starts to free spin. Like right there, the cap just started to move. Right there, the cap just started to move and the rod started to spin. You're eventually going to get to where the rod's free spin. Don't panic, because that's why we include two wrenches, because you put one on the other end to hold it. Alright, I'm going to put this down because it's probably not good to be dragging this part all over the table. Another little tip here is people tend to over tighten these screws, like I said, because they're smaller. Do not use the long end of the wrench like this, because you just get too much leverage. Let your fingers sort of be your guide. That little end doesn't give you as much leverage, and it basically hurts when you get too tight. So if it starts to hurt your hand, stop. Jump it across to the other one. It just doesn't take all that much, because our reservoirs work at less than 5 psi, which for water cooling, typically your pump's going to put out less than 5 psi. To put that in perspective, I think the human lung, if you like put your lips together and puffed out your cheeks, we develop about 2 or 2.5 psi. So it's basically twice the pressure that you can make just blowing with your lungs. So it's not a super high pressure system. You're just going to keep tightening around until it's already tight enough. I'm basically just double checking to make sure I didn't forget one of the screws. That one's a little loose. If you do happen to strip out a screw, don't beat yourself up. It does happen. It usually happens when your wife or your girlfriend's standing next to you yakking about something and you're not paying attention to what you're doing. If you do strip one out, the reseller where you bought your reservoir sells them in little individual packages that you can just replace them. It's not a big deal. It does happen. Own it. That's basically all there is to that. Next up, we'll go ahead and put the mounts on. I strongly recommend that you actually mount the mounts the first time outside the case, because the first time you put these screws into the holes, because you're mounting a round surface to a round surface, it can be a little tricky. So go ahead and mount them for the first time outside the case, just to get the holes, the threads kind of used to having a screw in there. It's pretty basic stuff. I'm just barely starting the screws so that if you don't tighten it all the way, because then you might have a hard time getting the second one to start. Like right there, I'm good. This is the spreader bar. This would actually go on the back side of the panel that you're mounting the reservoir to, but just for the purpose of the example, I'm going to put them on like this. What this does basically is two things. It spreads out the load so that you don't have all the weight of the reservoir in one small point. It kind of relieves point loading. And the second thing is, when you drill the holes to mount your reservoir, if you miss a little bit, you can take your drill and kind of round out the hole in the panel that you've drilled to make the screws fit. And this will cover up any little, we'll call them measuring discrepancies. Just barely going to start these. I guess I should keep that in the frame so you can see what we're doing, huh? And this is where, if you choose to use lights, the mounts also come in a 25mm, a taller mount if you need it to stick a little further away from the mounting surface. And they come in a 12mm low profile. We're also working on a end mount. You can see that in the first overview video I discussed. Alright, once the lights are started, basically just going to tighten the screws down. Again, do this once outside the case before you mount it inside your case. It just makes the threads a little easier to work when you're elbow deep in your case later on. You're trying to line everything up and hold it in place and all that. It's a little easier on you if the threads have already sort of been pre-conditioned like this. And that's all there is to doing basically all of the assembly. Maybe give it a quick wipe down all your fingerprints. We have a lot of dust because I'm actually filming this in our shop, which has a lot of tools that are just generating all kinds of dust and debris. This isn't exactly an optimal environment, but basically that's all there is to assembly. You can go ahead and, if you have any, they don't include the plugs, so if you are not going to be using all the ports that you've ordered, make sure you get plugs. After you throw them on the ground, make sure you clean off any lint again, because that will cause a seal problem later on. That's basically all there is to assembly. That's why we call this the basic assembly video. Got your reservoir, ports, lights. That's all there is to it. If you have any questions, you can contact me on the email address listed right here. I'm happy to discuss selecting your components, assembly, mounting in your case. Anything you need to talk about, you can use this email. Thanks for watching.